The morning Sarah Chun was arrested, she was teaching a self-defense class to teenage girls at the community center in San Diego. The FBI agents who walked through those doors had practiced this moment dozens of times. They had studied her background, analyzed her claims, and built what they believed was an unshakable case against her. What they hadn't prepared for was the way she would react when they announced she was under arrest for impersonating a United States Navy SEAL. Sarah didn't run. She didn't protest her innocence or demand to see a lawyer. Instead, she calmly asked her students to form a circle, took a deep breath, and told them something that would haunt the federal agents for months to come. Sometimes, she said, looking each girl in the eye, the truth is so dangerous that people will destroy you for speaking it. Remember that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when the whole world tells you you're wrong. Then, she turned to the lead agent, a man named Detective Rodriguez who had spent 3 months building this case, and said something that made him question everything he thought he knew. "The tattoo on my shoulder," she said quietly. "Ask Admiral Murmured about it. Tell him the Phoenix remembers." Rodriguez had no idea what that meant, but something in her voice made him write it down anyway. 3 hours later, as he sat in the interrogation room, watching Sarah Chun refuse to answer questions about her military service, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The case against Sarah had started 6 months earlier when a military blogger named Marcus Webb posted a detailed investigation into her background on his website, Stolen Valor Watch. Webb had built a reputation for exposing fake military heroes, and his research into Sarah Chun seemed airtight. According to every official record he could find, Sarah Chun had never served in any branch of the United States military. Her social security number showed no military service. Her background checks came up clean of any armed forces involvement. Yet she had been quietly working as a military consultant for 3 years, training law enforcement in advanced combat techniques and speaking at veterans events about her experiences in classified operations. Webb's investigation had uncovered video footage of Sarah demonstrating combat techniques that seemed far beyond what any civilian should know. She could field strip an MP-5 submachine gun blindfolded in 32 seconds. She spoke fluent Arabic, Pashto, and 3 other languages commonly used in Middle Eastern operations. Most damning of all, she had detailed knowledge of specific military operations that had never been made public, including tactical details that only someone who had been there could possibly know. The blogger's post had gone viral within hours. Veterans groups across the country demanded her immediate arrest. Military forums exploded with rage at what appeared to be one of the most audacious cases of stolen valor in recent history. The pressure on federal prosecutors became overwhelming when a retired Navy SEAL named Commander Thompson publicly challenged Sarah to prove her service record or face justice. But Sarah Chun had done something that confused everyone involved in the case. Instead of backing down or disappearing, she had doubled down on her claims. In a series of interviews with local news stations, she had provided even more specific details about her service, including dates, locations, and operational details that seemed impossible for a civilian to know. She spoke about missions in Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq with the kind of casual precision that only came from lived experience. The federal prosecutors who took on the case were confident they had an easy win. Led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, the prosecution team had spent months documenting what they saw as a clear-cut case of military impersonation. Walsh had prosecuted dozens of stolen valor cases and had never seen someone maintain such elaborate lies in the face of overwhelming evidence. The defendant has created an entire fantasy life around military service that never happened, Walsh told the press during her first statement about the case. She has deceived veterans organizations, law enforcement agencies, and the general public with increasingly elaborate stories about classified military operations. The evidence will show that Sarah Chun is nothing more than a skilled liar who has studied military culture enough to fool people who should have known better. The prosecution's case seemed unbreakable. They had Sarah's complete civilian background check, showing she had worked as a software engineer for a tech company in Silicon Valley from 2018 to 2021. They had testimony from her former colleagues who said she had never mentioned military service during the 3 years she worked there. They had school records showing she had attended UC Berkeley, graduating with a computer science degree in 2018, with no gap in her education that could account for military training. Most importantly, they had official statements from the Navy Personnel Command confirming that no one named Sarah Chun had ever completed SEAL training or served in any Navy Special Operations capacity. The military's position was clear and unambiguous. Sarah Chun was a fraud, and her claims were not only false but potentially damaging to national security. The defense attorney appointed to represent Sarah was a public defender named Michael Reeves, who specialized in white-collar crime. Reeves had never handled a stolen valor case before, and he was struggling to understand why his client refused to cooperate with any reasonable plea agreement. The prosecution had offered her a deal that would result in minimal jail time and community service in exchange for a public admission that her claims were false. Any rational person facing the evidence against Sarah would have taken that deal immediately. But Sarah Chun was not behaving rationally. She insisted that every detail of her military service was true, even when Reeves explained that the evidence against her was overwhelming. She provided him with operational details that seemed incredibly specific and authentic, but she could not produce a single piece of official documentation to support her claims. No military ID, no service records, no photographs from her time in service, no contact information for fellow SEALs who could vouch for her. She's either the most elaborate pathological liar I've ever encountered, Reeves told his paralegal after their third meeting, or something very strange is happening here. The details she provides are too specific, too technical, and too accurate to be completely fabricated. But I can't find a shred of official evidence to support any of it. The strangest part of Sarah's story was her explanation for why no official records of her service existed. She claimed that she had been part of a classified program called Project Phoenix that operated outside normal military channels. According to Sarah, Project Phoenix recruited civilians with specific technical skills for short-term, highly classified missions that required absolute deniability. Participants in the program received intensive military training equivalent to Navy SEAL standards, but their service was never officially recorded in any military database. The whole point of the program was plausible deniability, Sarah had explained during one of their meetings. If we were captured or killed during operations, the government could honestly say we had never been in the military. Our civilian backgrounds were maintained and updated to cover our real activities. We were ghosts, officially speaking. Reeves had researched extensively, but could find no evidence that Project Phoenix had ever existed. Military historians he consulted said that while the U.S. government had certainly operated classified programs using civilian contractors, nothing matching Sarah's description had ever been publicly acknowledged or leaked. The level of training she described would have been incredibly expensive and logistically complex, making it unlikely that such a program could have operated without leaving some trace in government budgets or personnel records. The case had attracted national attention by the time it went to trial. Military advocacy groups packed the courthouse, demanding justice for what they saw as a particularly offensive example of stolen valor. Veterans who had legitimately earned their military honors were outraged by Sarah's claims, and many had traveled from across the country to witness her conviction. The media coverage had been uniformly negative towards Sarah. Military reporters who had covered Pentagon affairs for decades said her story was clearly fabricated. Retired Special Operations personnel appeared on news programs to explain why her claims were impossible and offensive. The consensus among experts was that Sarah Chun had created an elaborate fantasy based on publicly available information about military operations and was now facing the consequences of her deception. But there were a few details that bothered Detective Rodriguez as he prepared for the trial. Small things that didn't quite fit the narrative of Sarah as a simple fraud. During her arrest, she had remained completely calm under extreme stress, displaying the kind of emotional control that usually came from extensive training. Her physical fitness was extraordinary at a level that suggested years of professional conditioning. Most puzzling of all, she had demonstrated knowledge of classified operational procedures that shouldn't have been available to any civilian. Rodriguez had spent 15 years investigating military fraud cases, and something about Sarah Chun didn't match the typical profile. Most stolen valor cases involve people who exaggerated limited military service or claimed ranks and honors they had never earned. But Sarah was claiming service that, according to all official records, had never happened at all. The level of detail and consistency in her story suggested either an incredibly sophisticated fraud or something else entirely. The tattoo she had mentioned during her arrest was another puzzle. Rodriguez had looked for it during the booking process and found a small, intricate design on her left shoulder blade. It appeared to be a phoenix rising from flames, but the artwork was unusually complex and included symbols that he didn't recognize. When he had asked Sarah about it, she had simply said that anyone who understood its significance would know what it meant. 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, Rodriguez had followed up on Sarah's cryptic message and contacted Admiral Morrison's office. Getting through to a flag officer was nearly impossible for a local detective, but Rodriguez had persistent contacts in military law enforcement who helped him navigate the Pentagon bureaucracy. When he finally reached Admiral Morrison's aid and mentioned Sarah Chen's name and the message about the Phoenix, the response had been immediate and unexpected. Admiral Morrison will see Detective Rodriguez tomorrow morning at 0800, the aide had said. This meeting is classified. Bring no recording devices and tell no one about this conversation. Rodriguez had never been inside the Pentagon before, and the experience of meeting with a 3-star admiral was surreal. Admiral Morrison was a tall, serious man in his early 60s who had spent most of his career in naval intelligence and special operations. His office was filled with commendations and photographs from deployments around the world, but what struck Rodriguez most was the Admiral's reaction when he mentioned Sarah Chen's tattoo. For just a moment, Admiral Morrison's composure had cracked. Something that might have been recognition, or possibly fear, had crossed his face before he regained control. Describe the tattoo exactly, Morrison had said, his voice carefully neutral. Rodriguez had provided as much detail as he could remember, focusing on the unusual symbols surrounding the Phoenix design. As he spoke, he watched Admiral Morrison's expression grow increasingly troubled. When he finished, the Admiral had been silent for nearly a minute, staring out the window at the Potomac River. Detective Rodriguez, Morrison had finally said, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. You cannot discuss this with anyone, including your supervisors, without direct authorization from the Secretary of Defense. Do you understand the implications of what I'm saying? Rodriguez had nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he did understand. Military security classifications were outside his normal experience, but he recognized that Admiral Morrison was deadly serious. The tattoo you've described, Morrison had continued, contains symbols that should not exist outside of a very specific, very classified military program. If Sarah Chen has that tattoo, and if the symbols are authentic, then either we have a massive security breach that threatens national security, or your stolen valor case is about to become something much more complicated. Admiral Morrison had refused to provide any additional details, but he had made one request that confused Rodriguez even more. I need to see this tattoo personally, the Admiral had said. I need to be present when Sarah Chen's case goes to trial. Can you arrange for me to be there as an observer? Rodriguez had agreed, though he had no idea what he was setting in motion. As he left the Pentagon that afternoon, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Sarah Chen case was about to explode in ways that no one had anticipated. The woman they had arrested for stolen valor might actually be telling the truth about her military service, which meant that everything the prosecution had built their case on was wrong. But if Sarah Chen was telling the truth, then the implications were staggering. It would mean that the U.S. military had operated a classified program that recruited and trained civilian operators to Navy SEAL standards while maintaining their civilian identities as cover. It would mean that these operators had conducted missions so sensitive that the government was willing to destroy their lives rather than acknowledge their service. And it would mean that Sarah Chen had been abandoned by the same government she had risked her life to serve. As Rodriguez drove back to San Diego that evening, he realized that the trial scheduled to begin in 2 days was going to determine much more than whether Sarah Chen was guilty of stolen valor. It was going to determine whether the United States government was willing to admit that some of its most sensitive operations had been conducted by people who officially didn't exist. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose secrets that some people would kill to protect. And at the center of it all was a woman with a tattoo that might prove that the most impossible stories are sometimes the most true. The federal courthouse in San Diego had never seen anything quite like the circus that surrounded United States versus Sarah Chun. By 7 in the morning, 3 hours before proceedings were scheduled to begin, veterans groups had formed protest lines outside the building. News vans from every major network crowded the street, their satellite dishes creating a technological forest against the Southern California sky. Inside the courthouse, security had been increased to unprecedented levels, though no one would explain exactly why. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh arrived at her office 2 hours early, making final preparations for what she expected to be the most straightforward stolen valor prosecution of her career. Her evidence was overwhelming. Her witnesses were credible, and the defendant's story was so outlandish that no reasonable jury would believe it. Walsh had prosecuted cases against people who claimed to be Medal of Honor recipients, former prisoners of war, and decorated combat veterans, but none of them had made claims as elaborate or as easily disprovable as Sarah Chan's. The prosecution's opening strategy was simple: systematically demolish Sarah's credibility by showing the jury that every aspect of her claimed military service was fabricated. Walsh had arranged for representatives from the Navy Personnel Command to testify that no Sarah Chun had ever served in any capacity. She had former SEALs ready to explain why Sarah's claims about her training and missions were impossible. Most importantly, she had documentation showing Sarah's complete civilian background from high school through her arrest, with no gaps that could possibly account for years of military service. Michael Reeves, Sarah's defense attorney, sat in his office staring at a legal pad covered with notes that made no sense. His client's story remained impossible to verify through official channels, but the details she provided continued to be so specific and technically accurate that he couldn't dismiss them as complete fabrication. The problem was that specificity and accuracy weren't enough to overcome the complete absence of any supporting documentation. The strangest development had come the previous evening when Detective Rodriguez had contacted Reeves to inform him that a senior military officer would be attending the trial as an observer. Admiral Morrison's presence was unexplained and unusual, but Rodriguez had been unable to provide any details about why a 3-star admiral was interested in what appeared to be a routine stolen valor case. Sarah Chun spent the morning before her trial in a holding cell, reviewing notes she had written by hand during her months of pretrial detention. She had refused every plea bargain offer and had insisted on testifying in her own defense, despite Reeves's strong advice against it. Her notes contained operational details, personnel descriptions, and mission timelines that would either expose her as the most elaborate liar in military justice history or prove that she had served her country in ways that the government was now denying. The most painful part of her situation wasn't the criminal charges or the public humiliation. It was the abandonment by people she had trusted with her life. During her 3 years of service in Project Phoenix, Sarah had worked alongside men and women who had become her closest friends and most trusted colleagues. She had saved their lives, and they had saved hers. Now, according to official records, none of those people existed, those missions had never happened, and her service had never occurred. Judge Patricia Hamilton entered the courtroom at exactly 10 o'clock to find every seat occupied and a line of spectators extending into the hallway. Military personnel in dress uniforms filled the front rows, most of them veterans who had traveled from across the country to witness what they expected to be Sarah's conviction. The atmosphere was charged with anger and anticipation, as if the crowd was watching a sporting event rather than a criminal trial. Admiral Morrison sat in the back row, dressed in civilian clothes and accompanied by 2 men who were obviously security personnel. His presence had caused a stir among the military personnel in attendance, most of whom recognized him, but couldn't understand why an officer of his rank was observing a routine stolen valor prosecution. Morrison's expression was carefully neutral, but His eyes never left Sarah Chun as she entered the courtroom in handcuffs. Walsh's opening statement was masterful in its simplicity. She told the jury that they were about to witness the prosecution of one of the most audacious cases of military fraud in recent memory. Sarah Chun, she explained, was a skilled liar who had studied military culture and operations extensively enough to fool veterans organizations, law enforcement agencies, and the media. But lies, no matter how elaborate, could not stand up to the weight of official documentation and testimony from actual military personnel. The evidence will show, Walsh told the jury, that the defendant has never served one day in the United States military. She has fabricated an entire military career out of publicly available information and her own imagination. She has dishonored every man and woman who has legitimately served their country, and she has endangered national security by pretending to have access to classified information that she could never have legally obtained. Reeves's opening statement was more uncertain, reflecting his own confusion about the case. He asked the jury to listen carefully to the evidence and to consider the possibility that there were aspects of military operations that the public and even the court might not fully understand. He warned that the case might be more complex than it appeared and that the truth might not align with official documentation. The prosecution's first witness was Commander Lisa Parr from the Navy Personnel Command, who testified with absolute certainty that no person named Sarah Chun had ever completed Navy SEAL training or served in any special operations capacity. Park had brought complete service records showing every person who had entered SEAL training during the time period when Sarah claimed to have served, and Sarah's name did not appear anywhere in those records. Under cross-examination, Reeves asked Park whether there were any military programs that operated outside normal personnel tracking systems. Park acknowledged that certain classified programs might maintain separate records, but she insisted that SEAL training was too visible and too extensively documented to be hidden for personnel databases. The prosecution's second witness was retired Master Chief Peterson, a Navy SEAL with 25 years of experience who had served as an instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center. Peterson testified that Sarah's descriptions of SEAL training contained inaccuracies that proved she had never actually experienced it. According to Peterson, her knowledge appeared to come from movies, books, and internet research rather than lived experience. But Peterson's testimony took an unexpected turn during cross-examination when Reeves asked him about specific training exercises that Sarah had described. Several of Peterson's answers revealed that Sarah's descriptions were actually more accurate than he had initially indicated, including details about advanced techniques that weren't widely known outside the SEAL community. The defendant's knowledge is surprisingly detailed, Peterson admitted under persistent questioning. Some of the techniques she describes are taught only in advanced courses that aren't covered in most public sources. I'm not sure how she would have learned about them without some form of professional training. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from Sarah's former colleagues at the Silicon Valley Tech Company, where she had worked from 2018 to 2021. Her former supervisor, David Kim, testified that Sarah had been a reliable software engineer who had never mentioned military service during her employment. According to Kim, Sarah had taken only standard vacation time and had never been absent for extended periods that could account for military training or deployments. But Kim's testimony also revealed some puzzling aspects of Sarah's civilian employment. He acknowledged that Sarah had been in exceptional physical condition, far beyond what was typical for software engineers. She had also demonstrated unusual stress management abilities and had remained calm during company crises that had panicked other employees. Most unusually, Sarah had occasionally used technical terminology and problem-solving approaches that seemed to come from outside the technology industry. The prosecution's most damaging witness was supposed to be Marcus Webb, the military blogger whose investigation had initiated the criminal charges against Sarah. Webb had spent months researching Sarah's background and had documented what he believed was clear evidence of elaborate fraud. His website post about Sarah had been viewed more than 2 million times and had been cited by veterans groups as definitive proof of her deception. But Webb's testimony became problematic for the prosecution when he was forced to admit under cross-examination that some of Sarah's technical knowledge had surprised him. During their confrontational interview before her arrest, Sarah had provided details about weapons systems and tactical procedures that Webb hadn't expected a civilian to know. He had initially dismissed these details as lucky guesses or information gleaned from internet research, but subsequent fact-checking had revealed that her information was not only accurate, but current. The defendant demonstrated familiarity with equipment modifications and tactical updates that aren't widely discussed in open sources, Webb admitted reluctantly. Some of the procedures she described were recently implemented and wouldn't be known outside active military units. I'm not sure how she obtained that information. The prosecution's case began to show cracks during testimony about Sarah's language abilities. The government had brought in Dr. Maria Santos, a linguistics expert who had tested Sarah's proficiency in Arabic, Pashto, and Farsi. Santos had expected to find the superficial knowledge typical of someone who had learned languages from books or online courses, but instead had discovered near-native fluency in all three languages, including regional dialects and military terminology. The defendant's language skills are extraordinary, Santos testified, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of her findings. She speaks Arabic with a Syrian dialect that includes specific military terminology, Pashto with pronunciation patterns typical of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region, and Farsi with vocabulary that suggests extensive interaction with native speakers. These are not skills that could be acquired through classroom study or self-teaching. Walsh tried to minimize the significance of Santos's testimony by suggesting that Sarah could have learned languages through extended foreign travel or civilian employment abroad. But Santos pointed out that acquiring such specific military terminology and regional dialects typically required years of immersion in military environments, not tourist travel or business trips. The prosecution's case suffered its most serious damage during testimony about Sarah's combat skills. The government had arranged for a demonstration in which Sarah would be asked to perform basic military tasks to prove that her claimed expertise was fraudulent. The demonstration was conducted at a local police training facility under controlled conditions, with military experts observing and evaluating her performance. The results were devastating for the prosecution. Sarah demonstrated weapon handling skills that exceeded those of many active-duty military personnel. She completed advanced tactical movement exercises flawlessly and showed familiarity with equipment and procedures that weren't taught in civilian training programs. Most remarkably, she performed a complex hostage rescue simulation with precision that suggested extensive professional training. Captain Rodriguez, the Marine Corps officer who supervised the demonstration, was forced to testify that Sarah's performance was consistent with someone who had received advanced special operations training. Under cross-examination, he admitted that her skills were well beyond what could be acquired through civilian training programs or self-study. By the end of the prosecution's case, Walsh realized that her supposedly airtight stolen valor prosecution had become something entirely different. Instead of proving that Sarah Chan was a fraud, the evidence had raised serious questions about why someone with obvious military training had no official record of service. The jury was clearly confused, and several military personnel in the gallery were whispering among themselves about the implications of what they had witnessed. Judge Hamilton called for a recess before the defense case began, and during the break, Admiral Morrison requested a private meeting with both attorneys. In the judge's chambers, Morrison explained that he needed to examine Sarah's tattoo before the trial proceeded any further. His request was unprecedented, but his authority was undeniable. The tattoo examination was conducted in a secure courthouse facility with only Morrison, the judge, both attorneys, and a court stenographer present. When Sarah removed her shirt to display the phoenix tattoo on her shoulder blade, Admiral Morrison's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He leaned forward, studying the intricate symbols surrounding the phoenix design, and his face went pale. "My God," Morrison whispered, so quietly that only the stenographer caught his words. "It's real. It's all real." The symbols incorporated into Sarah's tattoo were not random decorative elements. They were operational codes that had been used in Project Phoenix, a classified program that Morrison had helped design and oversee from 2018 to 2021. Each symbol represented specific missions, training achievements, and security clearances that could only have been earned through actual service in the program. The tattoo was essentially a classified service record that had been permanently inscribed on Sarah's body. Morrison asked for an immediate closed session with Judge Hamilton, during which he explained that Sarah Chin's case involved national security implications that required immediate attention from the highest levels of government. The trial would need to be suspended while Morrison contacted his superiors at the Pentagon and the intelligence community. "Your Honor," Morrison said, his voice tight with stress, "this case is about to expose a classified program that involves ongoing operations and the safety of personnel who are currently deployed in hostile territories. We need time to assess the national security implications before this trial proceeds any further." Judge Hamilton had presided over federal cases for 15 years, but she had never encountered a situation where a routine criminal trial had suddenly become a matter of national security. Morrison's request was unprecedented, but his authority and obvious concern convinced her that the situation was legitimate. The trial was suspended indefinitely, with all participants ordered to maintain strict confidentiality about the proceedings. Admiral Morrison left the courthouse immediately to contact his superiors, while Sarah was returned to federal custody pending resolution of what had become a national security crisis. In the hours that followed, secure communications channels between the courthouse, the Pentagon, and the CIA carried urgent messages about Project Phoenix and its implications. Senior officials who had hoped never to discuss the program again were forced to confront the possibility that its existence was about to be exposed in a public forum. Sarah Chun sat in her cell that evening, knowing that her tattoo had finally been recognized by someone who understood its significance. After months of being called a liar and a fraud, she had been vindicated by the one person who knew that her service record was written in ink and skin rather than in official files. But vindication came with its own dangers. Project Phoenix had been designed to operate in complete secrecy, and the exposure of its existence could endanger other operatives who were still active in the field. Sarah knew that the government might decide that protecting those secrets was more important than protecting her, and that her life might depend on decisions being made in Washington by people who had never met her. The case that had started as a simple stolen valor prosecution had become a test of whether the United States government was willing to acknowledge the existence of programs that operated outside all normal legal and military frameworks. And at the center of that test was a woman whose only crime had been telling the truth about service that was never supposed to have existed. The secure conference room deep within the Pentagon had hosted discussions about nuclear weapons, terrorist threats, and international crises, but the meeting that convened at 0300 hours on a Tuesday morning was unlike anything in the building's history. 12 of the most senior officials in American intelligence and military operations sat around a polished oak table, each holding a classified folder marked with warnings about unauthorized disclosure. The subject of their emergency session was a woman in a San Diego jail cell whose tattoo had just exposed one of the most secret programs in U.S. military history. Admiral Morrison sat at one end of the table, still shaken by his examination of Sarah Chin's tattoo 18 hours earlier. Across from him was CIA Deputy Director Catherine Wells, whose face showed the strain of a sleepless night spent reviewing Project Phoenix files that she had hoped were permanently buried. General Marcus Thompson, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, presided over the meeting with the grim expression of a man who knew that every decision made in the next few hours could have consequences lasting decades. "Before we begin," General Thompson said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room, "I want everyone to understand the implications of what we're discussing. Project Phoenix was terminated 3 years ago precisely because we knew that its exposure could compromise ongoing operations and endanger personnel around the world. The fact that we're having this conversation means that our worst-case scenario is now unfolding in a federal courtroom. Project Phoenix had been conceived in 2017 as a response to the changing nature of asymmetric warfare and international terrorism. Traditional military operations were increasingly constrained by political considerations, international law, and the need for plausible deniability in sensitive regions. The program's architect had proposed creating a unit of highly trained operatives who would maintain civilian identities while conducting missions that required absolute secrecy. The selection criteria for Project Phoenix had been extraordinarily specific. Candidates needed advanced technical skills, psychological profiles that indicated exceptional stress tolerance, and personal circumstances that would allow them to disappear from civilian life for extended periods without raising questions. Most importantly, they needed to be willing to serve their country without any possibility of recognition or official acknowledgement. Sarah Chun had been recruited in late 2017 while working as a software engineer in Silicon Valley. Her technical expertise in cybersecurity and her fluency in 3 Middle Eastern languages had made her an ideal candidate, but what had really caught the attention of Phoenix recruiters was her psychological profile. Independent psychological testing had indicated that Sarah possessed the rare combination of moral courage and emotional stability needed for operations that would test the limits of human endurance. The recruitment process had been elaborate and completely invisible to anyone outside the program. Sarah's civilian employer had been contacted through carefully constructed intelligence channels and had unknowingly provided cover for her extended absences. Her training had taken place at facilities that officially didn't exist, using instructors whose involvement was never recorded in any military database. The training protocol for Project Phoenix was equivalent to Navy SEAL standards. Admiral Morrison explained to the assembled officials, many of whom were learning about the program for the first time. These operatives received 18 months of intensive preparation, including advanced combat training, language instruction, technical skills development, and psychological conditioning. They were essentially special forces operators who maintained civilian identities as operational cover. Deputy Director Wells had spent the previous day reviewing after-action reports from Phoenix missions, and the scope of the program's activities was staggering. Over its 4 years of operation, Phoenix operatives had conducted missions in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, Somalia, and a dozen other countries where official U.S. military presence was either impossible or politically unacceptable. They had rescued hostages, eliminated terrorist leaders, gathered intelligence, and conducted sabotage operations that had prevented multiple attacks on American soil. Sarah Chen's operational record within Project Phoenix was particularly impressive. She had completed 11 missions between 2018 and 2021, including 3 that had been classified as near impossible by traditional special operations standards. Her technical expertise had allowed her to penetrate computer networks that had been considered impregnable, while her language skills had enabled her to operate effectively in environments where Western operatives typically struggled. Agent Chen's most significant operation was the disruption of an Iranian nuclear facility in 2019. Wells reported to the group, reading from classified files that detailed Sarah's achievements. She spent 3 months operating undercover as a computer technician, gradually gaining access to systems that controlled centrifuge operations. Her sabotage activities set back Iran's nuclear program by at least 18 months, possibly longer. The termination of Project Phoenix in 2021 had been triggered by concerns about long-term operational security and the psychological toll on operatives who were living double lives. Intelligence officials had recognized that the program's success was also its greatest vulnerability. Operatives like Sarah were becoming so skilled and so knowledgeable about sensitive operations that their eventual exposure could compromise national security. The shutdown protocol for Phoenix had been designed to provide operatives with new civilian identities and financial support in exchange for absolute silence about their service. Sarah and her fellow operatives had been given extensive psychological counseling and had signed agreements that legally bound them never to discuss their military experience. They had been promised that their service would remain classified indefinitely, but that their sacrifices were appreciated at the highest levels of government. The problem, General Thompson observed grimly, is that we never anticipated a situation where one of our operatives would be prosecuted for stolen valor. The shutdown protocol assumed that Phoenix personnel would return to civilian life and blend back into society without drawing attention to their background. Sarah's decision to work as a military consultant after leaving Project Phoenix had been a violation of her agreement, but intelligence officials had initially chosen to ignore it. Her consulting work involved training law enforcement in basic combat techniques, which seemed harmless enough, and her psychological evaluations had suggested that she needed some connection to military culture to maintain her mental health. The mistake had been allowing her to continue that work after her activities began attracting public attention. The viral blog post that had exposed Sarah's claims about her military service had created an impossible situation for Phoenix administrators. They couldn't acknowledge her service without exposing the entire program, but they couldn't allow her to be prosecuted for fraud when her claims were entirely accurate. The federal charges against Sarah had put the government in the position of prosecuting someone for telling the truth about her service to the country. Our options are extremely limited, CIA Director Wells explained to the group. If we acknowledge Sarah Chen's service, we compromise operational security for other Phoenix personnel who are still active in classified assignments. If we allow her prosecution to proceed, we establish a precedent where the government can destroy the lives of its own operatives for political convenience. The broader implications of the Sarah Chen case extended far beyond Project Phoenix. American intelligence agencies operated dozens of programs that relied on unofficial personnel and unacknowledged operations. If the government was seen to abandon operatives who had served in classified programs, recruitment for future sensitive missions would become impossible. No one would be willing to risk their life and their future for a government that might later deny their service and prosecute them for fraud. Secretary of Defense James Crawford had remained silent through most of the meeting, but his eventual contribution shaped everything that followed. Crawford was a former special operations officer who had spent his career in programs that operated at the margins of official policy. He understood the human cost of classified operations better than anyone else in the room. "We have a fundamental choice to make," Crawford said, his voice heavy with the weight of command decisions that had haunted him for decades. "We can protect the institutional interests of our intelligence agencies by allowing Sarah Chen to be destroyed, or we can protect the principle that this government doesn't abandon its people, even when acknowledging them is inconvenient." The discussion that followed was intense and sometimes heated. Officials who had devoted their careers to maintaining operational security argued that exposing Project Phoenix would endanger lives and compromise national security. Others contended that abandoning Sarah Chen would undermine the moral foundation of American intelligence operations and make future recruitment impossible. Admiral Morrison found himself in the unexpected position of advocating for full disclosure of Phoenix operations. His examination of Sarah's tattoo had convinced him that she had earned the right to acknowledgement, and his conversations with Phoenix instructors had reinforced his respect for the operatives who had risked everything for missions they could never discuss. Sarah Chen served this country with distinction in operations that most people will never know existed, Morrison argued. She earned that tattoo through service that was every bit as dangerous and important as anything done by officially acknowledged military units. If we destroy her life to protect our institutional secrets, then we've lost sight of why those secrets matter in the first place. The meeting stretched through the night as officials weighed options that all carried significant risks. They could arrange for the charges against Sarah to be quietly dropped, but that would raise questions about why the prosecution had been abandoned. They could provide classified evidence to support her defense, but that would require partial disclosure of Project Phoenix. Most drastically, they could acknowledge her service publicly and deal with the consequences to operational security. By dawn, consensus had emerged around a compromise solution that satisfied no one completely, but offered the best hope of protecting both Sarah and the integrity of ongoing operations. The government would acknowledge that Sarah Chen had served in a classified capacity, but would provide no details about specific operations or the broader program structure. Her prosecution would be terminated, but she would be required to sign new agreements limiting her future discussions of her service. The implementation of this decision required coordination between multiple agencies and unprecedented cooperation from the federal court system. Judge Hamilton was briefed on the national security implications of the case and agreed to seal all proceedings related to Sarah's military background. The prosecution was officially terminated due to newly discovered evidence that exonerates the defendant, with no additional explanation provided to the public or the media. Admiral Morrison returned to San Diego the following afternoon to meet with Sarah in federal custody. Their conversation was brief, but emotional, representing the first time in 3 years that her service had been officially acknowledged by anyone in government. Agent Shun, Morrison said, using her Phoenix designation for the first time since the program's termination, your country owes you an apology. You served with distinction in operations that kept America safe, and you should never have been put in a position where telling the truth about that service resulted in criminal prosecution. Sarah's response was characteristically direct. Sir, I never needed recognition or acknowledgement for my service. What I needed was the assurance that my government wouldn't try to destroy me for refusing to lie about what I had done for this country. The tattoo on my shoulder represents 3 years of my life and 11 missions where I risked everything for operations that I believed in. I wasn't going to pretend that service never happened, even if acknowledging it meant going to prison. The charges against Sarah Chun were formally dropped at a brief hearing the following Monday. The courtroom that had been packed with angry veterans demanding her conviction was nearly empty, as media interest had mysteriously evaporated over the weekend. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh provided no explanation for the prosecution's decision beyond stating that newly discovered evidence had made conviction impossible. Sarah walked out of the federal courthouse as quietly as she had been arrested, with no fanfare or media attention. The veterans groups that had demanded her prosecution were confused by the sudden termination of the case, but were told only that classified information had been involved and that no further explanation would be provided. The broader implications of the Sarah Chun case reverberated through intelligence and military communities for months after her release. Project Phoenix remained officially classified, but word of its existence spread through secure communications networks, serving as both warning and reassurance to personnel involved in other sensitive programs. The government had demonstrated that it would ultimately protect operatives who serve in classified capacities, but only after putting them through legal and personal ordeals that could have been avoided with better planning. For Sarah, vindication came with new restrictions and ongoing security concerns. Her agreement with the government allowed her to acknowledge that she had served in a classified military capacity, but prohibited her from providing any details about her training or operations. She was essentially in the same position she had been in before her arrest, with official acknowledgement of her service, but an inability to provide specifics that would satisfy skeptics. The tattoo that had saved her remained a permanent reminder of service that most people would never understand or believe. The phoenix rising from flames had proven to be an accurate symbol for Sarah's experience, emerging from destruction stronger than before, but bearing scars that would never fully heal. In Washington, officials who had participated in the emergency meetings about Sarah's case recognized that Project Phoenix represented both the possibilities and the dangers of classified operations. The program had achieved remarkable success in protecting American interests, but its secrecy had nearly destroyed the life of one of its most dedicated operatives. The lessons learned from Sarah Chun's prosecution would influence intelligence policy for years to come, establishing new protocols for protecting personnel involved in classified operations and ensuring that future operatives would not face criminal prosecution for acknowledging their service. But those changes came too late for Sarah, who had paid a personal price for serving her country in ways that officially never happened. Her story became a cautionary tale within intelligence communities about the human cost of absolute secrecy and the moral obligations that governments owe to people who risk everything for missions they can never discuss. The woman with the phoenix tattoo had forced the most powerful military in the world to confront the contradictions between operational necessity and institutional loyalty, and her courage had ultimately changed how America protects its most secret servants. 3 months after her release from federal custody, Sarah Chun stood in the parking lot of a Veterans Rehabilitation Center in Phoenix, Arizona, watching former Project Phoenix operatives arrive for the first and last reunion they would ever have. The government had reluctantly agreed to allow this single gathering as part of the psychological support program designed to help former Phoenix personnel transition to civilian life. What Sarah saw emerging from cars and Walking across the asphalt made her understand the true cost of the secret war they had all fought. James Mitchell walked with a pronounced limp, the result of an injury sustained during a mission in Somalia that had never been officially recorded. According to his civilian medical records, he had broken his leg in a hiking accident. But Sarah remembered the firefight where he had taken 3 rounds while covering her retreat from a terrorist compound. The government had provided excellent medical care through unofficial channels, but the psychological impact of being unable to acknowledge how the injury had really occurred had left James isolated and struggling with depression. Maria Santos moved with the hyper-vigilant awareness that Sarah recognized from her own behavior since returning to civilian life. Maria had spent 18 months operating undercover in Syrian refugee camps, gathering intelligence about ISIS recruitment networks while pretending to be a relief worker. The trauma of witnessing atrocities she couldn't prevent, combined with the stress of maintaining false identities, had left her with PTSD symptoms that she couldn't discuss with civilian therapists who lacked the security clearances necessary to understand her real experiences. David Park appeared to be the most successful of the group, working as a security consultant for tech companies in Silicon Valley. But Sarah could see the signs of the emotional strain that they all carried. David's specialty had been electronic warfare and cyber operations, and his missions had involved remotely controlling systems that affected the lives of thousands of people. The weight of those responsibilities, combined with the isolation of being unable to discuss his work with family or friends, had left him functionally estranged from everyone outside the Phoenix community. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the psychologist assigned to facilitate the reunion, had spent 6 months studying the unique challenges faced by Phoenix operatives. Her research had revealed patterns of adjustment difficulties that were distinct from those experienced by traditional military personnel. Phoenix operatives suffered from what she termed identity fragmentation, the psychological strain of maintaining civilian personas while processing traumatic experiences from military operations they couldn't acknowledge. The fundamental problem, Dr. Warren explained to the group as they gathered in a secure conference room, is that normal psychological healing from combat trauma requires the ability to process experiences within a community that understands and validates what you've been through. Phoenix operatives have been denied that community, forcing them to cope with severe trauma in complete isolation. The reunion had been organized as part of a broader government effort to address the mental health crisis that was emerging among former Phoenix personnel. 6 months after the program's termination, intelligence officials have been alarmed by reports of depression, substance abuse, and relationship problems among people who had been among the most psychologically stable individuals in military service. Sarah's prosecution had forced the government to confront the long-term consequences of completely erasing the service records of highly trained operatives. Lisa Rodriguez had perhaps suffered the most visible consequences of Phoenix service. During a mission in Afghanistan, she had been forced to assume the identity of a local woman whose family had been murdered by Taliban forces. For 3 months, Lisa had lived in a refugee camp, gathering intelligence while pretending to be grieving the loss of children who had never existed. The psychological strain of that extended deception had triggered a breakdown that required hospitalization under a cover story about a nervous breakdown related to work stress. "I spent a year in therapy talking about imaginary problems," Lisa told the group, her voice still carrying the anger that had sustained her through the darkest period of her recovery. "I was supposed to be dealing with the stress of losing a promotion at my civilian job, when what I was really processing was watching children die in a refugee camp while I pretended to be someone else. How do you heal from trauma when you can't even name what happened to you?" The psychological challenges faced by Phoenix operatives were compounded by the practical difficulties of readjusting to civilian life. Unlike traditional military personnel, they couldn't draw on networks of fellow veterans who understood their experiences. They couldn't seek treatment through Veterans Affairs medical facilities because they had no official military records. Most painfully, they couldn't share their experiences with family members who had watched them leave for civilian jobs and return clearly changed by experiences they could never discuss. Robert Kim's marriage had ended 6 months after his return from Phoenix service, not because of anything he had done, but because of everything he couldn't explain. His wife had watched him develop insomnia, hypervigilance, and emotional detachment that she attributed to problems at his supposed civilian job. When she had suggested counseling, Robert had been unable to explain that he was already receiving therapy through classified channels for trauma that she could never know about. The worst part wasn't the missions, Robert explained to the group. The worst part was coming home and lying to my wife about why I was different. She knew something had happened to me, but I couldn't tell her what it was. Eventually, she decided that if I couldn't trust her with the truth about my life, then we didn't have a marriage worth saving. Sarah's own readjustment had been complicated by the public nature of her prosecution. While other Phoenix operatives had been able to disappear quietly back into civilian life, her case had made her a figure of controversy within military and veterans communities. Some people believe the government's ultimate acknowledgement that she had served in a classified capacity, while others remained convinced that she was an elaborate fraud who had somehow manipulated the legal system. The isolation imposed by security requirements had been particularly difficult for Sarah because her Phoenix service had become such a defining part of her identity. For 3 years, she had been part of something larger than herself, contributing to missions that she believed were making the world safer. The return to civilian life had left her feeling purposeless and disconnected from the sense of meaning that had sustained her through the most challenging period of her life. Dr. Warren's research had revealed that Phoenix operatives were experiencing rates of depression and anxiety significantly higher than those found among traditional special operations personnel. The difference seemed to be related to the complete absence of recognition or community support. Traditional military personnel could draw on unit cohesion, veteran networks, and public appreciation for their service. Phoenix operatives had only their own internal resources and whatever support the government could provide through carefully hidden channels. The psychological impact of service without acknowledgement is something that we're still learning about, Dr. Warren told the group. Human beings need their experiences to be witnessed and validated by others. When trauma occurs in complete isolation, healing becomes exponentially more difficult. The reunion provided the first opportunity for Phoenix operatives to discuss their experiences with people who truly understood what they had endured. For 8 hours, in a secure facility where they could speak freely, they shared stories about missions that had never been officially recorded, processed emotions that they had been carrying alone for years, and began to rebuild the sense of community that their secret service had forced them to sacrifice. James Mitchell described the disorientation of receiving a Purple Heart equivalent through unofficial channels while being unable to explain to anyone how he had earned it. The medal sat in a secure deposit box that his family didn't know existed, representing service that he could never acknowledge but couldn't forget. The gap between his official civilian identity and his real military accomplishments had left him feeling like he was living someone else's life. Maria Santos talked about the difficulty of maintaining relationships with friends who knew her as a relief worker when her real experiences involved combat operations and life-or-death decisions. The constant need to edit her stories and hide her reactions to current events had created a sense of permanent distance from everyone in her civilian life. She had become skilled at pretending to be someone she wasn't, but the psychological cost of that deception was becoming unbearable. David Park's struggle was with the technical nature of his contributions. His cyber operations had prevented terrorist attacks and saved lives in ways that were measurable and significant, but he couldn't share those achievements with anyone outside classified circles. The isolation was particularly painful because his work had been so successful. He had accomplishments that would have made him proud in any other context, but they had to remain forever invisible. The reunion also provided an opportunity for Phoenix operatives to learn about the changes that their service had prompted within intelligence communities. Sarah's prosecution had led to new policies protecting personnel involved in classified operations, ensuring that future operatives would not face criminal prosecution for acknowledging their service. The case had also resulted in improved psychological support systems and better planning for the transition back to civilian life. Admiral Morrison attended the final session of the reunion to provide an official acknowledgement that had been years overdue. His remarks were brief but significant, representing the first time that Phoenix operatives had received recognition from senior military leadership. Your service to this country was real, it was dangerous, and it was successful, Morrison told the assembled group. The fact that it cannot be publicly acknowledged does not diminish its importance or our gratitude for your sacrifices. You conducted missions that traditional military units could not have accomplished, and you did so with distinction and courage. Morrison's acknowledgement was meaningful, but it also highlighted the ongoing contradictions in the Phoenix situation. The government could privately recognize their service, but could never provide the public acknowledgement that would fully validate their experiences. They would remain forever caught between their real identities as military operatives and their official identities as civilians who had never served. The reunion ended with commitments to maintain contact through secure channels and to continue supporting each other through the ongoing challenges of life after Secret Service. Dr. Warren established protocols for ongoing psychological support that would acknowledge their real experiences while maintaining operational security requirements. The government agreed to provide improved benefits and services while maintaining the classified nature of their service. For Sarah, the reunion provided both healing and renewed purpose. Seeing the struggles of her fellow operatives reinforced her conviction that their service deserved acknowledgement, even if that acknowledgement could never be complete or public. She decided to use her unique position as the only Phoenix operative whose existence had become public to advocate for better treatment of personnel involved in classified operations. The Phoenix tattoo on her shoulder had originally represented her training and service in the classified program. After the reunion, it began to represent something broader, the possibility of rising from the destruction that Secret Service had brought to all of their lives and building something meaningful from their experiences. The symbol had saved her from prosecution, but it would also serve as a reminder of the responsibility she carried to protect others who had made similar sacrifices. In the months that followed, Sarah worked quietly within government channels to improve policies affecting classified operatives. Her prosecution had exposed serious flaws in how the government treated personnel involved in secret programs, and her advocacy helped ensure that future operatives would receive better support and protection. The work was necessarily invisible and could never be publicly acknowledged, but it represented a continuation of her service in a different form. The hidden cost of Secret Service, Sarah had learned, was not just the danger of missions or the stress of maintaining false identities. It was the long-term psychological impact of being unable to integrate traumatic experiences into normal human relationships and community structures. The Phoenix operatives who gathered in Arizona that day had all paid that price, and their reunion was both an acknowledgement of their sacrifice and a step toward healing wounds that could never be completely explained to the outside world. Their story remained classified, their achievements unrecorded, and their struggles invisible to the public they had served. But in that secure conference room, surrounded by people who understood the cost of fighting a secret war, they had found something that no classification level could diminish: the knowledge that their service had mattered, their sacrifices had been real, and their dedication to protecting their country had been worthy of the price they had paid. 2 years after her prosecution ended, Sarah Chun stood before a closed session of the Senate Intelligence Committee, delivering testimony that would never appear in public records, but would fundamentally change how America protects its most secret servants. The senators in the secure hearing room represented both political parties and decades of oversight experience, but none of them had ever encountered a witness quite like Sarah. She was living proof that the government's most sensitive operations were carried out by people who officially didn't exist, and her story had forced Congress to confront uncomfortable questions about accountability, oversight, and moral obligation. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chairwoman, had spent 3 months reviewing classified materials related to Project Phoenix and similar programs. What she had discovered had shaken her faith in the oversight systems that were supposed to protect both national security and individual rights. Programs like Phoenix operated in a legal gray area where traditional safeguards didn't apply, creating situations where dedicated servants of their country could be abandoned or even prosecuted for the very service that made them valuable. Ms. Chun, Senator Williams began, your case has exposed fundamental flaws in how we handle classified operations that require unofficial personnel. You were nearly destroyed by the same government you had risked your life to serve, and That represents a failure of our systems that goes far beyond your individual situation. Sarah's testimony that day was the culmination of 2 years of quiet advocacy work that had taken her through the highest levels of American intelligence and military leadership. Her prosecution had created a precedent that terrified officials responsible for recruiting personnel for sensitive operations. If the government could abandon Phoenix operatives, what message did that send to potential recruits for future classified programs? The problems extended far beyond Project Phoenix. Sarah's research had revealed dozens of similar programs operating across multiple agencies, all of which relied on personnel whose service could never be officially acknowledged. These programs included cyber warfare units, deep cover intelligence operations, and specialized military formations that conducted missions in countries where the United States had no official presence. Thousands of Americans had served in these programs over the past decade, and many of them faced the same challenges that had nearly destroyed Phoenix operatives. Dr. Michael Torres, a former intelligence official who had helped design oversight protocols for classified operations, had been working with Sarah to document the scope of the problem. His research had revealed a pattern of systemic failures in how these programs were managed, from recruitment through termination. Personnel were often selected for psychological profiles that made them ideal for dangerous missions, but poorly suited for readjustment to civilian life. Training programs focused intensively on operational skills while providing minimal preparation for the isolation and psychological challenges of maintaining false identities. The fundamental issue, Dr. Torres explained to the committee, is that we've created a two-tier system of military service. Official military personnel receive comprehensive support systems, recognition for their service, and legal protections that acknowledge their status. Unofficial personnel receive none of these benefits while often undertaking more dangerous missions and accepting greater personal risks. The legal implications of this two-tier system were staggering. Unofficial personnel had no recourse through military justice systems, no access to veterans' benefits, and no legal standing to challenge decisions about their service or termination. They could be abandoned, prosecuted, or even eliminated without any of the due process protections that applied to official military personnel. Sarah's case had been unusual only because her prosecution had become public. Most similar situations were handled through classified channels that provided no oversight or accountability. Senator Robert Shun, no relation to Sarah, had spent 30 years in military service before entering politics, and he understood the importance of unit cohesion and institutional loyalty in military effectiveness. What disturbed him most about the Phoenix situation was how it undermined the fundamental trust between service members and their government. If word spreads through military communities that the government will abandon or even prosecute personnel who serve in classified programs, recruitment for those programs will become impossible, Senator Chen warned his colleagues. No rational person will accept assignments that require risking their life and their future for a government that might later deny their service. The committee's investigation had revealed that recruitment for sensitive programs was already becoming more difficult as word of Phoenix operative struggles spread through military and intelligence communities. Potential recruits were asking increasingly detailed questions about legal protections and post-service support, indicating that the government's credibility in these areas had been seriously damaged. Sarah's advocacy work had focused on developing comprehensive reforms that would protect future personnel while maintaining operational security for sensitive programs. Her proposals included legal frameworks that would provide due process protections for unofficial personnel, psychological support systems that acknowledge their real experiences, and transition programs that prepare them for the challenges of returning to civilian life. The most significant of Sarah's recommendations involved the creation of a classified Veterans Affairs system that would provide benefits and support to personnel whose service could never be officially acknowledged. This parallel system would operate under the same security restrictions as the programs themselves, ensuring that personnel could receive appropriate care without compromising operational security. These men and women have earned the same rights to medical care, psychological support, and recognition that we provide to all other veterans, Sarah testified. The fact that their service must remain classified doesn't diminish their sacrifices or reduce our obligations to them. The implementation of these reforms would require unprecedented cooperation between intelligence agencies, military commands, and congressional oversight committees. Each organization would need to accept new levels of accountability and transparency while maintaining the secrecy that made these programs effective. The challenge was creating systems that could protect both national security and individual rights without compromising either. Admiral Murmured, now retired, had become one of Sarah's strongest supporters within military leadership. His experience with Project Phoenix had convinced him that the military's approach to classified operations needed fundamental restructuring. He had spent the past year working with Sarah to design new protocols that would prevent future personnel from facing the abandonment and prosecution that had characterized the Phoenix experience. Sarah Chun forced us to confront the moral contradictions in how we conduct the most sensitive military operations, Morrison told the committee. Her courage in fighting for recognition of her service has led to reforms that will protect thousands of future operatives who will never know how much they owe to her example. The reforms emerging from Sarah's advocacy work would establish new standards for the treatment of personnel involved in classified operations. These standards would require informed consent protocols that fully explain the risks and restrictions of unofficial service, comprehensive psychological support throughout deployment and transition periods, and legal frameworks that provided due process protections while maintaining operational security. Perhaps most importantly, the reforms would establish permanent oversight mechanisms that would monitor the welfare of personnel in classified programs and ensure that their sacrifices were acknowledged and supported, even when that acknowledgement had to remain classified. These oversight systems would prevent future situations where dedicated servants of their country could be abandoned or prosecuted for the very service that made them valuable. The Phoenix tattoo that had saved Sarah from prosecution had become a symbol of transformation within intelligence and military communities. Her story was shared in classified briefings as an example of both the potential and the pitfalls of unofficial military service. The tattoo itself had been analyzed by security experts who recognized its value as a permanent, unforgeable record of classified service that could provide protection to personnel whose official records didn't exist. Following Sarah's example, other classified programs began incorporating similar permanent identification systems that would allow personnel to prove their service without compromising operational security. These systems range from biometric identifiers to encrypted digital records that could verify service while maintaining the secrecy necessary for ongoing operations. The broader impact of Sarah's case extended beyond policy reforms to fundamental changes in how Americans understood the nature of modern military service. Her story had demonstrated that the war on terror and other contemporary conflict were being fought not just by traditional military units, but by shadowy networks of unofficial personnel who risked everything for missions they could never discuss. Public awareness of these hidden dimensions of military service remained limited due to classification requirements. But within government and military circles, Sarah's advocacy had prompted serious reflection about the moral obligations that democratic societies owe to people who serve in programs that officially don't exist. The veterans community had also been affected by Sarah's story, which had challenged comfortable assumptions about the nature of military service and sacrifice. Traditional veterans organizations had initially resisted acknowledging the service of Phoenix operatives, but Sarah's persistence had led to the creation of new support networks that could provide assistance to personnel whose service couldn't be officially recognized. 3 years after her arrest, Sarah received a letter that represented the culmination of everything she had fought for since her prosecution began. The letter, which arrived through carefully secured channels, was signed by the President of the United States and acknowledged her service to the country in the highest terms possible while maintaining the classified nature of her specific activities. Your courage in defending the truth about your service has led to reforms that will protect thousands of Americans who serve their country in ways that must remain invisible, the letter stated. Your willingness to fight for recognition of unofficial military service, even at great personal cost, represents the highest ideals of American service and sacrifice. More meaningful to Sarah than presidential recognition was the letter she received from Dr. Warren, updating her on the progress of former Phoenix operatives who had benefited from the support systems that her advocacy had created. The psychological support programs, legal protections, and transition services that Sarah had fought for were helping dozens of former operatives rebuild their lives and process their experiences in healthy ways. James Mitchell had received appropriate medical care for his combat injuries and was working as instructor for new programs that incorporated the lessons learned from Phoenix experiences. Maria Santos had found employment with an organization that provided support to refugees, allowing her to use her experience in ways that felt meaningful while receiving appropriate psychological care for her trauma. David Park had established a consulting company that provided cybersecurity services while employing other former intelligence operatives who needed work that acknowledged their real skills. The reunion that had brought Phoenix operatives together 2 years earlier had evolved into an ongoing support network that provided community and understanding to people whose experiences couldn't be shared with anyone else. Regular gatherings, secure communications networks, and shared advocacy efforts had created the sense of unit cohesion that their Secret Service had originally denied them. Sarah's own life had stabilized around her new role as an advocate for personnel in classified programs. Her work necessarily remained invisible to the public, but within government circles, she had become a respected voice for reforms that balanced operational security with moral obligation. The skills she had developed during her Phoenix service, analytical thinking, stress management, and moral courage, proved equally valuable in advocating for systemic change within government bureaucracies. The tattoo on her shoulder remained a daily reminder of the service that had defined her life, and the fight she had won to have that service acknowledged. The phoenix rising from flames had proven to be an accurate symbol not just for her own transformation, but for the broader changes her case had prompted within American intelligence and military communities. In quiet moments, Sarah sometimes reflected on the irony that her most important service to her country had come not during classified missions in foreign countries, but during her fight for recognition in American courtrooms and congressional hearing rooms. The courage required to tell the truth about classified service in the face of government prosecution had ultimately proven more challenging and more consequential than anything she had done during her operational career. The story of Sarah Chan would remain classified for decades, known only to the people whose lives had been affected by her service and her advocacy. But the reform she had fought for would protect thousands of Americans who would serve their country in programs that officially didn't exist, ensuring that future operatives would receive the acknowledgement and support that their sacrifices deserved. The Phoenix had risen from the flames of prosecution and abandonment to create something lasting and meaningful from the ashes of betrayal. Sarah's fight for truth had transformed not just her own life, but the entire system that governed America's most secret servants, proving that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against the contradictions within the institutions we serve. Her legacy would live on in every future operative who received appropriate support, every classified program that operated with proper oversight, and every person who served their country in ways that could never be publicly acknowledged, but would never again be officially denied. The woman with the Phoenix tattoo had changed the hidden history of American service, one classified reform at a time.